Welcome to another South Beach Sessions. He's the best-selling author and national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's also the host, executive producer, and creator of Showtime's The Circus, Inside the Greatest Political Show on Earth. I recommend that show to you on Showtime. It's fun, and they do it a little bit differently. Let's start there, John, and thank you for joining us. I imagine Trump was very good for your show, and I imagine the show has really found its voice in the last 4 or 5 years, really accentuating the crazy.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for having me on. First time caller, long time fan. We started the show in 2016 to cover one election. That was, we thought we were going to be one and done. And it's a very hard show to make because we make basically a real-time documentary every week. So we start everything we shoot in the week that leading up to. We shoot, edit, produce, do the whole thing from starting basically on a Sunday, on a Monday usually, and shoot through Saturday, and then we have the show up on the air on Sunday. So no one had really ever done that before, and we didn't really know what we were doing when we decided to try to cover the presidential campaign in 2016 that way. I think like a lot of people, it was, you could imagine, I think you're anybody who hears that thinks, you guys are out of your mind. You're like really are building the airplane on takeoff. And I think, one and done was probably the right way to think about that. Like to 1 year and we'd be finished. And then, Hillary Clinton was going to be the most likely president of the United States. The idea that there would be a circus to cover in Washington, D.C. after a Clinton election didn't seem like an obvious thing. And then Trump won, and Showtime and all of us thought, well, the circus goes on. And we've been doing it, we're in the middle of the 8th season now. We just had our mid-season finale out last Sunday night. And so we've done 120 some odd episodes of the show. And I think you're right. I mean, look, Trump, he's good for the show, bad for the country, good for the show, good for the show in the sense that people, I think a lot of people who before 2016 were, if they were interested in politics at all, were casually interested. Like they paid attention when there was a presidential election and not much else. A lot of people became engaged with politics in the course of the Trump years. And I'd say that's true on both the left and the right. People who, were, as I said, casual now became obsessed with politics. I would have people, who used to come up to me. I used to get stopped in a supermarket, not that often. And someone would say, hey, I really like you on Morning Joe or whatever. Because I work at MSNBC also. And then, during the Trump years, it was like dozens of people every day on the street. And usually not just saying things like, hey, I saw you on TV, but rather, are we going to be okay? Is the country going to be okay? What's going to happen next? Like much more kind of existential kind of questions. And so
let me stop you right there. Are we going to be okay?
Yep. Are we going to be okay?
Yes.
I don't know. I've never I'm 57 years old. I've never answered that question any other way than absolutely yes. America's the greatest country in the world. And, we've been through a lot of shit and we'll be fine. And now I don't know. And I don't know for reasons that will probably open up some things you want to talk about. But, the level of polarization in the country now is so intense. And, you'd have to go back to the Civil War, the actual original first Civil War, the Civil War, to find a time when there's been so much antipathy between the two sides of the cultural, political, social divide. And it's not, in this case, it's not just that, unlike the Civil War then, where there were profound differences of views about like slavery and how the country's economics should be organized and all of that. Now there's those same disagreements and they're very deep and very passionate, and people really, really are like there's obviously lots of Americans who aren't on Team Red or Team Blue, but there are a lot of people who are very fiercely partisan on one side or the other. And it's not just that they disagree about things like what tax policy should be or should America be actively engaged in military operations abroad. They disagree about the nature of reality now. It's like we live in two countries that see things as we see just the facts of the case as being totally different. So, Donald Trump's his indictment last week, his arraignment this week, is going to be seen by a third to 40% of the country as the first sign of accountability, the first glimmer that like justice will be brought to a criminal president. And another 30 or 40% of the country think it's a travesty of justice. It's just all politics. It's a witch hunt. And Trump not only has done nothing wrong, but has done everything right. the facts in this case will be disputed. People will say not just, that hey, it should be fine to pay off a porn star, but Trump didn't do any of these things. He was set up. There was a conspiracy against him. That divide is very hard to close, and because of the after effects of January 6th, where it feels to me like political violence is more, people are more willing to contemplate it and maybe engage in it than they have been any time in our lifetimes. That's what worries me, is that like the divide is so deep and the nature of the divide is so profound, and people are now open to solutions that used to be unthinkable. That's why I don't know. I don't know if we're gonna be okay, and I don't know what the roadmap is out of it either. In case you're gonna ask me, how do we fix it? I have no fucking clue.
Why the hell am I having you on then? Like, you got no answers for anything. I'm asking you very basic questions. You're spending a lot of time thinking about, and
you're asking me the most existential questions we have, and they're also ones that are speculative. They're about the future. I can talk to you about why I think things are so screwed up. I just don't know. I don't know that anybody has an answer to how to fix it, or anybody who's been in the prediction business has had a hard time these last few years. We had a lot of black swan events.
What do you feel dumbest about getting the most wrong?
I think that I think that a lot of people, when in 2016 I was right about an important thing, which was I thought Trump could be the Republican nominee from the time he got in. And I thought that the Republican Party had changed in a way that would make it possible. I have thought for a long time that the parties had become kind of hollowed out, and that people didn't have any real association or affiliation with the parties. Like, no one gives a shit about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party anymore. And that the Republican Party particularly was ripe for a kind of hostile takeover. So I thought he could win it, and a lot of people thought I was nuts for that. And then I thought with equal confidence, there was no way that, given the way that the American electorate had been changing, particularly after the two Obama victories, a more diverse electorate, a younger electorate, all of that stuff meant that the demographics would make it impossible for Donald Trump to win the presidency in 2016. I just didn't see it. And I'm not alone, but I couldn't put that together. And I'd say the corollary to that, honestly, Dan, is that in 2020, there was a common way of thinking about what would happen in 2020 in that election, which was, Donald Trump has done nothing in 4 years to add anybody to his electoral coalition. He's campaigned just to his base, just to the MAGA faithful. He'd done nothing to, try to bring the country together. If you think about, George W. Bush, after winning a very narrow election in 2020, or in 2000, contested Supreme Court. He was in a minority. He didn't win the popular vote. The first thing he did when he got into office was he went and passed a big education reform that got 70 some votes in the Senate. Big bipartisan win. It was like, his thinking was, I have to get a bunch of people who didn't vote for me in 2000 in my column if I'm going to get reelected in 2004. That's kind of conventional political thinking. You want to add, not just keep talking to the people who already support you. Trump did the opposite of that for 4 years. And when you rolled into 2020, it's like, well, he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton in 2016. A lot of people are now are more turned off. How could he possibly win in 2020? And that's another thing I thought. I knew that Trump people were saying we are going to find people who didn't vote in 2016, that's how we're going to add, not by convincing people who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 to switch to Donald Trump against Joe Biden, but we're going to go find hardcore MAGA voters who didn't vote in 2016 and turn those people out. And I did not believe that there would be anything like the numbers of those people available to Trump to see him do what he did in 2020, not win the election, but get millions more votes than he got in 2016, millions more. I mean, and I think that what both of those things add up to is that I think I have a decent appreciation for how pissed off, frustrated, angry, alienated, and dissociated, I would say, from reality when it comes to the conspiracy theory, QAnon people. I did not in 2016, nor in 2020, even though I was a little better. I did not get the depth of it and the breadth of it. And I think it's the thing that I've tried to be more wised up to now, is just how many people there are who are fully outside what we would consider mainstream discourse. How do they get their news? Why do people believe that Barack Obama, Joe Biden, the Bushes, Bill Clinton are engaged today in a giant global child sex trafficking conspiracy. Why do they believe that? There's millions of people who believe that. Honestly, it's true. How is that possible? That's the thing that I think a lot of us are trying to, at least I am trying to get my head around. How can that be? Because, you know, you can think whatever you want about the deep state, but I think the notion that there's a giant global sex trafficking conspiracy of pedophiles who've been most of the past American presidents and every family you've ever read about in politics for the last 30 or 40 years. I think that's nuts. But a lot of people think it's true.
What do you find more dismaying? What are some of the things you find more dismaying than the alternate realities that suggest a hopelessness if people are going to look at facts? If they're going to see the same thing and they're going to see totally opposite things, I don't see where a bridge can be built there or how you build the bridge. What's more dismaying than that to you as someone who comes from media and vetting and, you know, whatever people say about the media being biased, that the media was aspiring at least to something that wasn't that.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know if there's anything. I mean, look, I mean, there are the persistence of unarmed black men mostly getting shot in the streets by police officers. I think most law enforcement does a really good job and a really hard job, and most cops are good people. But we still have a really pretty, if you just look at the numbers, we have a pretty profound systemic problem with the administration of justice in the country, where it is, you know, mostly that we have too many of those instances that continues to be such a large problem in so many places. It's not an epidemic, but it's way too common in America. That's, I find, you know, obviously hugely troubling, and that's obviously connected to a larger pattern of persistent racial bias and endemic kind of racism in the society. That I find that really troubling. I find, the fact that we don't have in a world where the rewards in the economy globally go largely now, they've gone more and more towards, and are going to only go more and more towards people who are highly educated, and that the people who are on the bottom rung of the income of the education and skills ladder do worse and worse, relatively speaking. And it's part of why there's so much frustration, is that so many families in America have not seen their prospects improve over the course of the last 30 years. I find that incredibly dispiriting. But really, this thing that we were just talking about, the wholly sealed, hermetically sealed information bubbles that Americans live in now, where we can't talk to each other on a place of common ground about, not just about like conspiracy theories and some of the really crazy shit that you could talk about, but just, you know, the country has big problems, you know, education, social welfare, the retirement, healthcare, all these big national problems. You can't really help to solve the big problems that the country faces if you can't have a conversation where at least we agree on the facts, even if we disagree on the solutions. And so that gap, that divide, that inability to close that gap and be able to have a conversation where you're, as Pat Moynihan used to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. That's, you know, to me, the big one. It's the one, and it's the one that I've seen in the course of how old are you, Dan?
I'm 54.
All right. So we're basically the same age. It's the one that I've seen accelerate the most over our time in media, where, you know, if somebody told me 30 years ago that they thought the New York Times was a liberal newspaper, I would say, I agree with that. You know, the New York Times is a liberal. It is, you know, and it's not just that the opinion page is liberal. It's that I could imagine how, if I was fiercely anti-abortion, how I would think that the news coverage in the Times slanted in a way that was unfair. I think there have been places where liberal bias in mainstream news coverage, in broadcast television, in some of the big East Coast establishment newspapers, you could see it. They weren't wrong about that. But those were people who were still, you know, I think we would agree, these were people who were like trying to get the story right and not trying, you know, fighting against their own biases. Everybody has them. Everyone has their opinions, right? And so the journalists get in the business to kind of be like, how do I test, in the course of reporting something, testing your biases, testing your inclinations. And I think we all looked, if in our business, people looked at places like the Times and the Post and said, do they get everything right? No. But do they have some biases? Yes. Are they trying their best to get to the truth? Yes. And that presumption is not shared at all anymore
Well,
among a large swathe of Americans.
But where and how did that happen, right? Because I've said this before, one of the greatest heartbreaks of my life is someone who loves the ideals of journalism and thinks they're important to protect democracy. How and why can an orange oaf with no grace whatsoever convince people more that he's a man of the people who's not a criminal grifter, and that the American media is so biased and corrupt that it's more biased and corrupt than he is?
I think that, I mean, look, part of it, what happened is technology happened. And like, it's an answer that a lot of people don't love to hear because it seems to like be too kind of clinical in some way. But, you know, in 1996, Fox News and MSNBC both started, just as an example. It's not the only place where this is true, but you know, the 500 channel cable universe gave an opportunity for people to build what was perceived at the time. There was a liberal network in MSNBC. Broadly, this is what people thought, and Fox News was going to be the conservative network. You know, they marketed themselves as being fair and balanced, but they were the conservative network, and that's what Roger Ailes foresaw, was that there were a bunch of people who felt like they weren't served well by those by the liberal media, what was seen as liberal mainstream media. And that, you know, you went from the 500 channel universe to the web, and then the rise of what was then the blogosphere, and now we have social media, and now we have more places where the segmentation of information has become more and more extreme. And Facebook, obviously, in places like that where millions of Americans get their news from Facebook, you know, where there's not really an editor, there's no journalistic standards, there's no news organizations there. This is just people passing shit around. And I think that opening up, the getting rid of the gatekeepers and allowing everyone to have a voice has done some good things. But what it also did was it created the, you know, they, in like linguistics theory, they use this, there's this phrase called epistemic closure, where it's like, and confirmation bias, these two ideas of, we just want to hear what we already believe, and we want to hear that reflected back to us. And then we're only talking to people who believe all the same things. And as that became the dominant paradigm in the media, the craziness kind of in both of those, in all the existing bubbles, kind of became more pronounced. And I do think it's like you got into the business where people, it's like in politics, you know, the competition in politics now, the thing that dominates our politics. If you think about, like, why is Trump so powerful in the Republican Party? People say, well, because the MAGA base does what he says, and if he turned against you as a Republican official, you would get primaried, right? So the dominant thing in our politics now is fear on the right, that if you don't hew to the farthest right position, someone will come along to your right and beat you in a primary. Not that you'll lose in a general election, but that you'll lose. The extremes in your own party will beat you. That's true also to some extent, lesser extent, but to some extent in the Democratic Party. And so the extremes have driven the conversation in politics, and the extremes have driven the conversation in media. And more the way that that people have found big audiences is by catering to the people who want to hear the most extreme things piped back to them. And those those sealed information bubbles have become the place where, in this very complicated media landscape that we live in, the place where you could find an audience. And no one wants the middle of the road anymore. No one finds that the way to get clicks. No one finds that the way to get eyeballs. And all of that just became a self-reinforcing thing where someone like Trump could characterize all of mainstream media as being far left, crazy town, conspiracy theory on the left media. There's a lot of other things going on, I would say, but this is a big part of it. Like if you tried to start a centrist network now, like I'm going to do a centrist cable news network, you couldn't raise money for it. Like you could, like no one would. Well, I ran a company for 3 years called The Recount, where we kind of came in and said, we're going to try to call bullshit on everyone, equal opportunity bullshit calling. And the first question every venture capitalist we talked to asked us is, well, what side are you going to be on? And we'd say, well, we're not going to be on the side of truth. And they'd say, where's the audience in that? Like, we're not, like, good luck. We'd love to see you succeed, but we're not going to write you a check And I think that's, it's the economics, it's how capitalism works in our media landscape. It's, if it bleeds, it leads, just at a more extreme level and with an ideological kind of component to it, rather than just the one that, bleeds, it leads being a crime thing. But you know what I'm saying? It's like and I think that's part of it. And Trump has just been very canny about being able to capitalize on that.
What is so in 2023 that if I'd gone to you 8 years ago as a seasoned journalist, you would have said, there's just no way that will be so in 2023. That's not possible.
That Donald Trump is I think in 8 years ago. So we're talking about, you're going back to 2015.
Oh, I'm just making it at some point.
Maybe that number.
Everything that you had learned up to your 40s about what was true about America and the world that you couldn't have fathomed morphing into 2023, what presently is in front of you. I'm not making this Trump related.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can't help it, because look, here's the most horrifying thing that's happened to me this year. Okay. Or that I've witnessed. I was in Waco for Trump's rally in Waco, however long ago that was, a couple weeks ago now by the time this airs. In Waco, a place where 30 years ago, a religious cult leader named David Koresh incinerated 82 of his own followers, including like 25 little kids, some of whom he had been previously raping, who were in their like 12 and 13-year-old girls. They had stockpiled a bunch of machine guns. And when the feds tried to break in, he lit the place on fire. That guy is now a martyr figure on the right. And you run into people who say, Donald Trump's just like David Koresh, and I hear that and think, would I want to be compared to David Koresh? I would not. No normal person would. They say he got sieged at Mar-a-Lago when the feds came down there, just like Koresh got sieged in 1993. And that's now, like, 30 years later, it's like this touchstone of the out of control government that are tyrannical and are trying to oppress people who have strong religious beliefs. And so Donald Trump holds a rally down there, the first big rally of his campaign, in that setting, and walks out on stage in front of, maybe 10,000 people, and plays a video from this group called the J6 Prison Choir. These are the people who've been arrested for staging an insurrection, tried to sack the Capitol on January 6th. These people are all incarcerated for having committed alleged crimes at that. And they've now recorded these guys singing the national anthem. Trump has recorded for this song a recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance. He goes out on stage in front of 10,000 people, plays that with his hand over his heart, and they play video images of the riot at the Capitol, of the insurrectionists beating cops with flagpoles, and that is celebrated. That's the Republican front runner for president in 2024 is a guy who is going to tell his followers, and it does that in the most concentrated way I can imagine in that story I just told you. He's going to tell them, hey, it's not just that January 6th wasn't as bad as you think, or some of these people were peaceful protesters, or the liberal media has perverted the story. He's saying January 6th was a great and glorious day in the history of the country. These people are political prisoners. They are patriots. They did the right thing. That's the center of the Republican frontrunners campaign for president, former president of the United States, now indicted. If you had asked me at any time prior to January 6th, 2021, I would have thought that was totally impossible. If you'd asked me about that 10 years earlier, I would have asked you like where you got the weed you'd been smoking, because I would want to smoke some of that weed, but it's doing something bad to your head. I find it unfathomable. It's the most un-American thing I may have ever seen in my life. From a political figure in our country. And that's where we are, and we're going to see a lot more of it over the next few months.
Why would Trump lose in 2020 and win in 2024?
I think it's very unlikely. I don't think it's impossible, though. I just have given up on impossibles. I think, the way our system works is you got to win the nomination of your party first. And people often ask these questions. They're like, hey, Trump is doomed in the general election. I say, well, we got a two-part thing here. And this is true in both parties. You got to win the nomination, or else you don't get to run the general election. The general election is a tomorrow problem. Trump right now is the most likely Republican nominee. His indictment And I would say even if he's indicted in multiple settings, maybe it will help him even more. This indictment in New York that we saw last week and that he's getting arraigned for this week, the mugshot, he's going to market the mugshot. We're going to see posters. I had Doug Brinkley, the historian, say to us in the last episode of the Circus, he's like, he's already out there quoting Jesse James. He's going to run as the outlaw president. He's going to make T-shirts and mugs and posters of the mugshot, and millions of people are going to buy them, like the MAGA hats. He's going to run on the basis of that. If he gets indicted in the special counsel cases in Washington or in the Georgia election fraud case, that's going to be more of a stigmata. He's making himself into the martyred outlaw candidate of the right. He's the most likely nominee. I don't understand who there is. Certainly the governor down there where you are, I always thought was overrated. And now others are kind of saying, yeah, I guess Ron DeSantis might not really do so well against Trump. But look, I mean, people will run against him, but he's likely to be the Republican nominee. And in our country, once you're the nominee of your party, you have some chance. You're going to get 48% of the vote, 47% of the vote, and we have an electoral college, so you can win without winning the national popular vote. Do I think Donald Trump has proven in 2018 in the midterms, 2020, 2022? He's gotten less popular over those times, over that time. He's caused damage to the Republican Party in the Senate, in the House. He lost himself. He lost for re-election. He's a loser at this point, just a proven loser. And there are lots of Republicans who see that and are like desperate to try to get rid of Trump for that reason. They don't think he can win in 2024. But he's going to run against, if he's the nominee, he's going to run against Joe Biden. Right now, 80% of Americans say that they don't want a president who's over 80 years old. Not about Biden, just they think that's too old, And an 80-year-old president running against Donald Trump with all of that energy in the Republican base is, Biden did not have to really run a conventional campaign in 2000 because of COVID. I don't think the math makes Donald Trump the likely winner of a general election against Joe Biden. Quite the contrary. And people in the Biden White House would like to run against Donald Trump more than anyone else. They fear anyone else, and they fear Ron DeSantis. They fear other people. But do I think it's impossible? It happens now. I mean, but it happens all the time.
But how is it possible that this is the best this country can do? That those two candidates, How is that the best we can do?
Hey, ma'am, you're a Democrat, right?
I'm not. I don't affiliate with any party. Politics has never been interesting to me my entire life. And so, yes, I'm a registered Democrat, but just what we're doing now isn't about party affiliations, or it's not about anything that represents me either. Like, it's just like, it's not just merely lesser evils, and lesser incompetences. It's just everybody's weak and incompetent. And I can't believe that these are our best choices as the world falls apart.
Well, look, I agree with you 100% about that. And I would say, one question is like, who wants this job? Who wants this job? Like, who wants to be president? Like in a situation like this? I mean, if smart, would you tell your kids to go and run for, want to go into politics as a career? It's a pretty brutal thing to be in that arena now. But, you think back to like 1988, I say all due respect to Governor Dukakis. I think a lot of people looked up and said, is Mike Dukakis really the best? Is that the most talented Democrat that we could put on the ticket? This question recurs. But I agree with you. How is it possible that it's two guys who are in there, one of them is going to be nearing 80, the other is going to be over 80? How can that be the case in this country, that we have a gerontocracy? Until this Congress changed over, you had the Democratic leaders were Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Jim Clyburn, all of them in their 80s. How can you have it like an old folks home as the leaders of the Democratic Party in the U.S. House of Representatives? Now that has changed, and the Democratic Party is led by younger people. But for a long time, it was just another example of the gerontocracy. Is it that all the best and the brightest young people look at politics and go, that's a fucking toxic sewer? I don't want to be part of that. Like, give me a job, in crypto, but I want to ask, but Dan, I want to ask you that question. I want to turn one question back on you. And I because I'm interested, as someone who is much more normal American in the sense of your relationship to politics than someone who either covers it or is in it. What's your answer to the question you asked me prior to that, which is like, what what are you most stunned by if you look at our national life, a thing that like 8 years, whatever, pick your years, 8 years, 10 years, whatever ago, you would never have believed possible. What's your take on that?
That fomenting hatred works among decent human beings who could be manipulated so that the divisions in this country make it feel like people are actually flippant about how precious freedom is.
That was a much shorter answer than mine.
Well, all of mine would be, because yours are long answers, but you got steamrolled on, I felt bad for you, on Real Time with Bill Maher, because you ran into somebody who is loud, boisterous, unspooling, charismatic, jokester. And I wanted to think, for those who did not see it, Russell Brand was next to John and just kept going and going, and he's very artful about dominating conversation. What did you really want to say to him that you couldn't get the opening to say because he kind of hogged the platform?
Well, I mean, look, I liked Russell Brand and get him to the Greek. He wants to be Joe Rogan. That's his thing. He got canceled. He's decided he wants to be the Rogan of Britain. He's got a big following. It's the Rogan audience, right? And so, he's on Rumble, Bumble, whatever that platform is that all the right wing guys are on. He's on the platform with Sean Hannity and Donald Trump Jr. and all of the whole alt-right conspiracy theory crowd. He peddles a lot of conspiracy theories about COVID. He peddles conspiracy theories about world government. He peddles a lot. It's just that is his spiel. I don't have a beef with people who have those views, whatever. The thing about the show that was frustrating was, and this, if you're a host of a show, you're in control of the show in theory, and you run the show. I mean, if I were hosting the show, I would not let a guest do that, filibuster in that way. And if you're a guest on the show, no one invited me to do a debate with Russell Brand. If someone said, hey, come in and let's do a debate with Russell Brand, I would have walked in being like, hey, okay, I'm ready to debate Russell Brand. I'm a guest. He's a guest. My attitude is, yes, I can speak at length, but I'm not there to fight with the guest. I've been on that show like 15 times. I've never been in an argument with anybody, even though the people on the panels I disagree with. The whole point of it's supposed to be a civilized discourse with people who disagree with each other on camera, not a thing where someone is going to filibuster and use, I don't know what the right phrase is for it. It's sophistry, right? It's that thing, it's crowd-pleasing sophistry, and Bill caught him on it later. He's like, there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. It's all the same. They're all corporate and they're captured, blah, blah, blah. And, if you'd had a decent conversation, you could have had a more thorough discussion in that it came up on the panel of, hey, man, like, okay, sure. But, Democrats were in favor of nationalized of universal health care. Republicans weren't. Like, that seems like for many, many Americans, a pretty important distinction. And you can say you're frustrated that our politics take place between the 40-yard lines. And I'd like to widen the sense of possibilities for more radical policies. But the reality is what Americans are voting on is, one party believes that the January 6th insurrection was okay at worst and glorious at best. Another party believes that it was an insurrection and that cops got killed, were beaten for doing their jobs, and that it was a fucking travesty. Those are not small differences, nor are the differences between believing in universal health care and believing not in universal health care. And I think that it's easy to do the bromide of everyone's corrupt, everything's bad, and hey, let's all hold hands and say kumbaya and pray for a better future, which seems to be, in terms of actual solutions or platforms that Russell Brand wants to put forward, that's kind of what he wants to say. Everyone needs to wake up and be, I don't, then that's, I think, my other question, which is, if you believe that there's a giant worldwide conspiracy of pharmaceutical companies, and defense contractors and the global elite, which in many cases for these people includes George Soros, the noted anti-Semite. They call him an anti-Semite, even though he's a Jewish man who fled the Holocaust from Hungary when he was a child. This giant global cabal, which is the Russell Brand line. It's like, if you believe all of that, like, I'd like to have and you think that our Democrats and Republicans, labor and conservative parties, whatever, that they're all basically the same. Like, what's your mechanism for, like, how are you going to change that? It's a question you've raised a little bit on this call, which is, I would have said, okay, like, what's the mechanism? How are we going to, other than scoring cheap points, decrying everyone and claiming they're all the same and they're all bad, and getting a big cheer from people who think that everybody sucks? Like, what's the program and what's the pathway towards some different kind of politics? This is my rational view. My less rational view on that show would have been, stop touching me.
Yes.
Which is like a dominance bullshit move that people do. And this because you've been on TV a lot, Dan. It's like, when some dude is touching you on television all the time, they're just basically, I have a dogs, it's like they're doing this dominance thing. And the truth is, when you're on TV with someone and they do that to you, there's nothing you can do. If you react to it, you're going to look like you're being overly sensitive. But the truth is, what you would do if someone did that to you in a bar is say, why are you touching me? Take your hands off me, or I'm going to punch you in the fucking face. But you're not going to say that on television with somebody because you're too polite, and you're going to look like, and you're going to look like you're being too sensitive. But I get this is a thing, right? He has a shtick. It was unfortunate to sit there and kind of tolerate it, but I'm a big boy. It's fine.
I've always found Bill Maher interesting. I've found his aging to be stubborn, and that young people don't have an appreciation for what his career is, how amazing a career it's been.
Yeah.
And now he feels threatened, but is covering it in bravado. Your thoughts on the changes in Bill Maher over the last, what's going on with him?
I mean, I'm a fan of Bill's, and he's had me on the show a whole bunch of times, and I appreciate it. And I guess I would say that the people often would, when Bill started to raise questions about COVID policy, for instance, this was a lightning rod for people, at least in social media. People would say, how can you go on that show with Bill Maher? And I would say, this goes back to the premise of the show. I would say, Bill's entitled to his opinion. He can say what he wants to say. As long as I get to have my opinion, I get to say what I have to say. That's fine. That's all right. If we're going to go on and we're going to sit in a place where Bill and some guests who all have different points of view get to state their points of view, that's cool. That's fine with me. And some of Bill's questions about certain things, like whether the masking policy really made sense or not, those are reasonable questions. I think that in general, I would say, Dan, that people Bill has been, fantastically acute on the dangers that Trump posed. He's been fantastically prescient about he said all throughout 2020, if Trump loses, he's not going to admit that he lost, and he's going to try to stay in power. And he did. That's a pretty big thing to get right. I would say that, I have some sympathy for those who think that woke culture has gone too far. But I don't think they're the same, that the threat to America that woke culture poses is the same as the threat that authoritarianism and autocracy poses. And so I don't, when I listen to when Bill says some of the things he says, I find myself thinking, I don't really even disagree with some of his attacks on the woke culture, but there's a little bit, he makes them seem like they're equivalent threats. He gives equal time to them. And I kind of want to say, hey man, you could take some shots at woke culture. I think some of the stuff that Chappelle says is really funny and really on the nose too, but is it really as big a threat as Donald Trump? You see how big a threat Donald Trump is. Let's think about proportion here, about proportionality. I think that's my main point. And I really respect the fact that even that throughout on that show, he's had an incredible career. And to this day, almost all the time, Russell Brand accepted, the show is generally a civilized place where people who come from different points of view, and the fact that it merges politics and culture the way it does, I find it really appealing. And it was kind of why the Brand thing was so surprising to me, because it was sort of like, hey, if you want to do an interview with Russell Brand at the beginning of the show and to go one-on-one with him, sure. If that's, what he's going to be like, bring him on, have the conversation, deal with it. But I think to put him on a panel was not necessarily wise. To put him in a panel situation with a co-panelist might not have been the wisest.
I asked this question innocently without knowing the answer to it. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that he is Rogan or Brand, but how is Bill Maher different than Rogan and Brand?
Well, look, I don't, I'm going to, I think, I mean, have never felt in any conversations with I've never been on Joe Rogan's show. So let me stipulate that. I've never seen Bill in any conversation I've ever been part of with him, either public or private, engage in the kind of bombastic, long-winded sophistry that Russell Brand did on that show. That's not the way that Bill runs that show. It's not the way he behaves in public. And not the way he conducts himself. I think that's a huge difference. There's no kind of like, there's no demagoguery to Bill's beliefs. I think he's
but he's got his convictions, and they're so stubborn about what he's learned. I think Brand and Rogan are actually more curious than Bill Maher is. I think Bill Maher is formed. He believes what he believes, and there will be no changing it. No new information will change it. And I say that, as I said, as someone who finds him pretty relentlessly interesting, but I also think he's shouting at clouds and young people now, clouds and college students.
I'll say that on that show with Russell Brand, he said, he as I said, he pointed out he pointed out two things that were in the middle of Brand's bromides. He said, hey, there really is a difference between Democrats and Republicans, and he stood up for that, and I think that's an important thing. And he also got in there and said, even as Brand was yelling about ivermectin and trying to use that as an example, well, I can say a little more about that if you want, but as he was yelling about ivermectin, Bill sort of stood up and said, I have a lot of doubts about various things about how COVID was handled, but some people needed these policies, right? And it saved people's lives. So I think there's I don't want to get into, I don't listen to Rogan on a regular basis. I really kind of meant more that Russell Brand was aiming at the Rogan audience, and I think that is true. I don't know that I think Russell Brand is more curious than Bill Maher. I'm not sure I would take that as I'm not sure that I would stand by that statement, but I do think that there are a lot of people. Then Bill is obviously tapping into something when he expresses the things he expresses about some of what a lot of people think are the excesses of woke culture. Again, I don't think that it is anything like some giant threat to American society in the way that some people seem to think. But I do think there are many people in America who are kind of like, I don't want to be told how to talk about stuff.
But this is the thing, right? This is Chappelle, and this is all of them. They'll protect comedy and the ability to make a living above all else. Like, it's not even... Like, Bill Maher's not protecting the democracy. Bill Maher is someone who was canceled for saying after 9/11 on a show called Politically Incorrect that you could call those kamikaze bombers a lot of things, but you couldn't call them cowards because that wasn't cowardice to give your life to something. He's protecting the ability to be Bill Maher, like to say whatever the hell he wants.
Well, and I look, I mean, I'm not sure that I think that's a problem. I'm not sure that's problematic. I'm just saying it's disguised as something else is all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's problematic. I mean, you're disguising it as a principle when all it is camouflage for you want to keep being able to do whatever the hell you want to do. And I don't blame you. I'd want to too if I were you. Yeah. I mean, look, I think that this is a case where, it's an interesting discussion around the comedians. When you hear, and I won't say it's just Chappelle, there's other people who are like this too, who sort of talk about the power of the trans lobby, what they would call the trans lobby, the power of them to cancel someone. And you're like, hey, you got to look at you're canceled. You're still filling up arenas, you're still making plenty of money, you still got the big Netflix contract. They have power. But they're not, to play about cancel culture when you haven't really been canceled in any meaningful way and you're still making a living seems sometimes a little bit off. I do think that there is a both the two things that I am not a big fan of false binaries. So it's like either or. I think you can both be upholding a principle, which is that people should be allowed to say what they want to say within obviously some limits, but there should be a big, broad avenue especially for artists, for creators, for people like comedians and other artists to be able to be transgressive, to say things that upset people and not get crucified for that. And that's an important principle in terms of how art works and how our culture talks to itself, and that there should be that people who are, and to use a Chappelleism, that people have become excessively brittle about some of that kind of commentary, and that is a principle worth fighting for, that people should be allowed to say things even if they rub some people the wrong way. and that principle aligns with their economic interests. I think those two things that's an and both to me, not an either or. And I think that I get, yes, that many people who champion free speech rights, that it is also, that's the way they want to be able to keep those rights because they make their money. But I don't think that means that they're wrong about championing the principle.
You can watch new episodes of The Circus on Showtime on Sundays. You can listen and subscribe to John's podcast, Hell and High Water, wherever it is you get your podcasts. Sir, I thank you for your time, and I do enjoy the show. I recommend that folks check out The Circus. It'll get you downloaded very fast. They do a very thorough job, and it's hard to do what they do, which is pull that off weekly at that kind of intensity. I cannot imagine how much time all of that takes. That doesn't seem in any way sane. Thank you, sir.